So, I'd like to take this time again to welcome Mr. Dave Mowat back to the stage. He's going to continue on and finish the Scugog history. Then he's going to go on into the Alderville First Nation history. And around that time, it'll be lunchtime. So once again, Dave Mowat.
Here we go. Here's an old map of the gunshot, poor map, and the Toronto Purchase. Toronto Purchase here, gunshot, 1788. Now, if we can start going down the map, just go down one more slide, please. This is another map of the gunshot in the Toronto Purchase area that was actually done by Michael Toms and David Carruthers for our Williams Treaties litigation. 1788, 87, 88, Crawford Purchase, gunshot, Toronto Purchase, sees settlement start to come into this area. And if we could start going down, and I want to just show you some maps that show how quickly the southern part of this province started to get surveyed out, and how the districts and the townships started to get laid out. So 1792, Upper Canada was created in 1791. And the first early districts are the Western Home, Midland, and the Eastern District. If you see this area here, of course, that's the area that we are concerned with when it comes to Scugog. Scugog Lake Scugog's not on this map. Next map, please. (1798). We start to see that there is settlement, there's pressure now building above the early treaty areas. So next map, please. 1826, 8 years after the Treaty Number 20, 8 years after 1818, Treaty Number 20. You can start to see, you can see the Newcastle District right there, and that is that's the area within which Treaty Number 20 is encompassed in the Newcastle District. 8 years after Treaty Number 20, we start to see the surveys encroaching on lands that are now within Treaty Number 20. If we go to the next map, please. Down. Okay, down, keep going, right there. 1838, 20 years after 1818, 20 years after Treaty Number 20. We see Durham Region extending up as far as around the Beaverton area. Scugog Island is actually intersected by the Newcastle District line and the York line. If we go to the next slide, 1845, we can see, again, we can see settlement and we can see surveyed townships moving further north. Next slide, 1851. We now see, out of the Newcastle District, we now see Victoria County, we see Peterborough County. Peterborough County, Hastings, Victoria. We start to see the counties that we know today being laid out. And I'm just illustrating this to show how our people were surrounded by increasing settlement. and trying to hang on to a way of life and how difficult that was. In 1846, so 1851, in 1846, 1844, the reserve at Scugog is surveyed, and that's the founding year. By 1846, the government comes up with this plan via the Bagot Commission, and amongst a whole other bunch of other things. The government now had an Indian problem. Our people probably said they had a government problem, but now there's an Indian problem. What are we going to do with the Indians? And so out of the Bagot Commission comes the idea of the industrial school. And Alderville was chosen as one of the sites for the industrial school, as well as Muncie. And no one's sound, although I do not believe one was ever built there. But the point is that the industrial school idea comes out of the Bagot Commission. And so within 2 years of the Scugog Reserve being surveyed, T.G. Anderson was trying to put pressure on the Scugog people to leave their land base and move to Alderville, where there would be a school built. And he was also trying to suggest to the other communities such as Mud Lake, Rama, Tyananaga was even involved in the discussions to move to the communities where there would be a school. And Anderson said, "Oh, you can hang on to your land." Yeah, sure. You can leave and go to the Alderville Reserve and go to school, and you can hang on to your land. Yeah. And Jacob Crane said, quote unquote, "But I bought this reserve, I bought this land with my own money," which is an interesting quote to suggest actually that we bought this land with our treaty money. And he didn't want to leave. And so that idea of removing the smaller groups to those communities where the schools would exist actually failed. It failed right from the start. But the school was built at Alderville. The cornerstone was laid in the early summer of 1849. And so that's another subject altogether, is the industrial school period. But I just want to illustrate the pressure that was on the Scugog, the small Scugog Island First Nation group, the pressure of settlement around them, but also the pressure on them to leave their community and move to Alderville, where they would enter the industrial school. They did not do that. Next slide, 1882. Now we can see how judicial organization is occurring right up into what we call the Williams Treaties Clause 1 lands, the northern hunting grounds. And we can see that white box right here. Part of that becomes Algonquin Park. So, the Royal Proclamation and Article 43 of the Future Plan of Indian Affairs in North America, the future plan for the management of Indian affairs in North America, 1764, and the Royal Proclamation 1763. What that did is that laid out the process in which how treaties would take place. Article 43 drilled down and it described who should be at a public meeting to surrender up land. The Crown would be represented. There'd also be a surveyor. There should also be a surveyor present. So the Royal Proclamation and Article 43 of the future plan laid out how treaties should take place. And of course, the Royal Proclamation said that no settlement would be allowed in any land until it was surrendered up to the Crown. Of course, that was a failure in the American colonies. But you will see that in 1882, while this judicial organization is occurring, that is actually in contravention of the Royal Proclamation, in contravention of what Article 43 said. This was occurring in 1882. I believe not too long after that, Algonquin Park is created. In the 1880s, I believe, the Watauga Mohawks moved from the Lake of Two Mountains to somewhere up around here. There's mining and lumbering occurring, all in the area that is unsurrendered, and all in the area that is supposed to not be settled. So the Williams Treaty's Clause 1 area is a prime example of how the Royal Proclamation was failed. The lands and so the lands encompassing the written record says the lands that encompassing next slide please, the lands encompassing what we know as Treaty 20 were surrendered and conveyed to His Majesty on November 5th, 1818. So we just passed the 200th anniversary of Treaty number 20. Scugog Island First Nation, one of the 3 modern signatories, lies within the Newcastle district at the north end of the island. Okay, here's a short. That's actually out of the treaties and surrenders. 6 chiefs and headmen of the tribes that signed the treaty. Let me see if I can remember them: Crane, Pike, White Oak, Eagle, Snake, and it'll come to me. I was looking at you, Tom. Crane, Pike, Snake, White Oak, Eagle, and it'll come to me. It'll come to me when I'm driving home. Next slide, please. So here's just a map of what would be the southwest corner of Treaty number 20, and you'll see that the line intersects the lower part of the island. And I pass these boundary roads every day as I go home, and so on this side of that line and into Port Perry is Williams Treaty's Clause 2 lands. Next slide. Yeah. My clan. Your clan. Yeah. Treaty number 20, that's another map showing how it encompasses the Kawartha Lakes, Scugog, Lake Scugog, Sturgeon, Balsam, Pigeon, Curve Lake over here, and the anomaly, the Alderville situation. Our people left the Bay of Quinte and moved onto the south side of Rice Lake and actually started to harvest and started to live within Treaty number 20, actually. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up pretty soon and try to make the transition, the segue to the Alderville piece. Just a couple more maps. Here's a map, next map, please. This map here shows, again, some of the development and settlement occurring around 1800. This is an interesting map because right here, this is not surveyed or not settled. And that is the lands that the Mississaugas, the Credit, were able to secure the fishery within that area. Interesting map. 1860, next map, please. Here's the level of settlement that we're seeing occur by 1860, the same decade that our people would start to grieve to the government about the loss of their traditional hunting grounds that we know as the Northern Hunting Grounds, 1860. Next map, and the Williams Treaties, 1923. Okay, so I want to thank you for that. I'm going to make the segue to the Alderville presentation if I could. Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Dave Mowat, and I'm from Alderville First Nation. I made a presentation recently at Queen's University, and I started it out with the two photographs of my great-grandfathers from Alderville. The one on the left is Peter Crow. Kiwitok Peter Crow. That picture is taken in 1919. He was He was 85 years old when he died in 1920. He died in August 1920. And I grew up close to my grandfather. My grandfather was born in 1905 when Peter Crow was 70 years old. And so I heard some interesting stories about Peter Crow. My grandfather would always kid and joke about he was born during the War of 1812. And of course, what did I know? Okay. But I wondered as I grew older what he heard from his father. Because his father was born in 1835 at Grape Island in the Bay of Quinte. His father before him, his mother was actually from Tyananega. His mother was a Claus, Sarah Claus from Tyananega. Peter Crow was baptized in the Anglican Church in the Mohawk Church in Tyananega. And so, sort of reflection of the intermarriage between the two groups. I was emceeing an event in Belleville in 2011, I believe, or 2010, regarding the Thurlow Purchase. And it was federal government was there. We had settled a small specific claim, and federal government was there, and our people and mayor of Belleville, et cetera, the police chief and all that. And this Mohawk guy in the back says, we're talking about the Mississauga history of the Bay of Quinte, and he yells out, "What about the Mohawks?" And everything went silent. I'd never been heckled before. I've only been heckled once when I was as a musician. I've only been heckled once, but I've never been heckled in a presentation. And it went silent, and I said, after about 45 seconds, "You know, when there was strife between our people, we married each other." And that sort of brought the temperature down. So Peter, he was the son of Sarah Claus and the father of the first Peter Crow. Musician. My grandfather would say when he remembers his father would go, "Hark," when he would hear something in old biblical way. Hark. The man on the right is my hero, Fred Simpson, born in 1878 in Alderville. And he is the reason I became interested in history. And you'll see two trophies here on the stage. This one here is that one there. When I was young, I probably 7 years old, 8 years old, I remember being in my grandmother's kitchen in Alderville, and I can remember hearing stories about Fred Simpson, the marathon runner. And maybe I heard these stories because I was the only young rugrat hanging around the kitchen. Maybe some of these stories were told for my benefit. I'm not sure. But I remember names like Durando Pietri, Tom Longboat, Shepherd's Bush, Fred Appleby. I remember hearing these names and wondering, who are these people? Where are these places? And so as I grew older, because of that story, that great story, and seeing these trophies in my grandmother's garage, at one time tarnished, the one on your right was broken, and I would look at them and I would wonder, what's this all about? And so through my own interests, I started to research his life and his story, Fred Simpson. And if we go to the next slide, please. This is one of the photographs that was emblazoned in my brain as a young child. And this had a huge influence on me and still does, actually. Fred Simpson, he won this trophy. He placed second in October 31st, 1907 in the Hamilton Herald Road Race in what's known as the Around the Bay Race, 19-mile, 166 yards, I believe. And it sort of put him into the limelight, that second place finish in the Hamilton Herald. At the time, 1907, Tom Longboat had won the Boston Marathon in April of 1907. And so our First Nations athletes and runners were starting to really come to the fore. It really wasn't until Longboat, marathon, the Boston Marathon, that First Nations athletes and runners really started to gain the notice of the white population and the media. Within 8 months, Simpson, he was invited to compete in the provincial Olympic champion or Olympic trial, provincial Olympic trial, and then about a month later, the national trial. He placed fourth in both trials, and he won a berth on the Canadian Olympic team. And so he traveled to England with the Canadian team, and he got all the press because Tom Longboat went separately with his manager, Tom Flanagan, to Ireland to train privately, individually. And so it was Simpson that got all the notoriety because he was the visible Anishinaabe. He got all the press. The London press followed him all over the place. And he became a favorite for the gold medal. And his trial times in London were impeccable in June and July to the marathon on July 24th. And so and because of that, because of his strong trial times and because of his impeccable times, he won the pole position. So this is Simpson here. He won the pole position, which is the front inside position of the race, like a car race. And Longboat, now you know you're nuts when you know even the shape of his head, I know who he is. Stephen Harper wrote a book on Canadian sport, and this was in his book, but he had Longboat the wrong place. I've studied this for all my life. It's actually on YouTube. In 1990, I was in Jumbo Video in Winnipeg, and I see this documentary on the Olympic marathon, it was a documentary on the Olympic marathon, and I rented it. And it was on the history of the Olympic marathon. And when it came to the 1908 piece, I thought, he's in there. And I watched him run right by the camera, my great-grandfather. It was the most riveting moment in my life, him run by the camera. And I can see Longboat running behind him over his left shoulder. And I've analyzed that, and I still watch it. Once a month maybe, just go back and it grounds me. And so this was a really famous in Alderville. And it was a famous story in Hiawatha as well. In 1899, Fred moved to Hiawatha and married his wife, Susan Muskrat. And so it was during his life and times in Hiawatha, raising the family, that he was competing. At one time, people thought he was from Alderville. And so this photograph, oh God, is it me again? This photograph, that was emblazoned in my mind from a young child, and it influenced my whole life. And just next slide, please. And here another photograph of Simpson, number 64, running through the streets of London. This fella here, the 08 Olympic Marathon is famous for the pathetic display of courage, the courageous attempt by Durando Pietri as he came into the stadium, and he was delirious, and he collapsed 4 times, and he almost died actually. And the British, who hated the Americans, they dragged Durando Pietri over the finish line, and he was disqualified. Sadly, he lived. This guy here, that's little Johnny Hayes, and he was the one that won the gold medal. Actually, he was second into the stadium, but because Pietri was disqualified, Johnny Hayes won the gold medal. Fred Simpson placed 6th for Canada. Tom Longboat collapsed at 19 miles. I was making a presentation in Hamilton, and Mary Jameson from Six Nations, she said, "You're a liar." No, I'm not a liar. It was a bad day for Tom that day. On a good day, nobody could beat Tom Longboat. But on July 24th, 1908, only very few could beat Fred Simpson. And so that's the story that got me interested in our community history. As a young boy, I wanted to know more. Who was his father? Who was his grandfather? Who was his great-grandfather? Who was his mother? And through that, I became interested in the story at large. Next slide, please. And that story takes us back to, in one facet, back to Kingston. Our people were known as the Mississaugas of the Bay of Quinte, and our people had arrived there. Some documents suggest that our people start to harass and I say harass the Five Nations in and around the Bay of Quinte as early as within the first 5 years of 1700. And so they were entrenched at the Bay in the early 18th century. If we go down to the next slide, when we went to trial with the Williams Treaties, we illustrated through mapping, and these maps were, held up, obviously, under trial. But these maps illustrate, when we grew up in Alderville, we were sort of led to believe that our people came out of the darkness in 1826 into the light, and that we had no traditions, and that we had no interest at the Bay of Quinte. And that was a story that I can remember really hearing. It was a strong Methodist story. But at trial, and through the whole process behind our litigation, a great deal of mapping came out, and these maps illustrate where our people retained their interests at the Bay of Quinte. And this area here is this is Belleville today. That is, I had mentioned that in 1818 the Scugog band acquired reserve land. This is the reserve that the Bay of Quinte Mississaugas retained for burial ground, 428 acres. That today goes right up through downtown Belleville. These other areas are points of land that our people retained for fishing, harvesting sites, burial sites, I'm sure. So in 1783, after the American Revolution, there's pressure to remove and relocate the United Empire Loyalists. And the first area that is focused on, amongst the others in Quebec and New Brunswick, St. John River. The St. John River, the Loyalists that went there actually justified the creation of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. But in these parts, the Bay of Quinte, that's where the early United Empire Loyalists came, was the Bay of Quinte. And the first township laid out in what became Upper Canada was at Kingston Township. And so that's 1783, October 1783. Our people said that they weren't concerned with the white people moving in, because I had said about the Scugog case, our people wanted to be around the white people because they could secure better trade goods. They could barter easier. Our people were concerned with the Mohawks moving into what became Tynanaga. That was their concern, that there would be increased pressure on the hunting grounds. Even though we hear about the dish with one spoon, we hear about that. It's up here, this language about the dish with one spoon up here, but when we sort of get into some of the record and we get into the minds of some of the people, that actually counters what the dish with one spoon sort of was suggesting up here. Our people were actually concerned with the pressure that the Mohawks moving in would put on the hunting grounds. Okay, so that early, okay, we could down one more, please. Yeah, this is a map of what becomes the Crawford Purchase. Now, this map is not necessarily, this is our interpretation. If you look on Alexander Morris's, the Morris maps, the Crawford Purchase is completely foreign to what this is suggesting. Again, in Crawford, our people contended that they retained points of land, areas in which to harvest and fish, fishing stations, very important area. There were actually 2 agreements, apparently, behind the Crawford Purchase. We've never seen the second one. We know the first one that allowed for Kingston to be surveyed out. But today, we agree that Jones Creek, what's known as Jones Creek around Brockville, is the eastern boundary of Crawford, our Crawford, which involved the Iroquois, but our Crawford, we use Jones Creek as the eastern boundary. And then the western agreement, the western portion took in Prince Edward County right over to the Trent River. And that is 1783 settlement starts to move in. And on the Scugog slide, I said within 5 years, so 1788, within 5 years, there's upwards of 17,000 settlers that have moved into this area. If we go down, yeah, next one, please. Our legal counsel advises us and Ontario of the following in the wake of the settlement. Crawford was based on as far as a man can travel in a day. Now, we wouldn't make an agreement like that today. I could probably walk farther than a shorter man. Is the wind to my face? Was the wind to my back? You know, there's 2 making a treaty like that. And so it was established at 12 miles. However, the Crown subsequently extended the boundary north to what is the southern boundary of Treaty number 27 and 27 and a corner. So the Crown unilaterally extended the boundary of what we knew as Crawford. If a man could walk 12 miles, the Crown unilaterally extended that boundary north. And so the province has been informed or reminded that Alderville First Nation's current understanding of the boundaries of Crawford as it pertains to the exercise of our harvesting rights is based on the map above. Okay, next. Okay. So on the Royal Proclamation, the proclamation set out in relatively loose terms how treaty should take place. It was Article 43 that sort of drilled down and said it'll be at some public meeting, a surveyor will be present, a representative of the Crown, and the Indians affected. And Crawford is probably the best example of how that wasn't followed. There's still discrepancy about the boundary of the Crawford Purchase. Okay, so after 1783, it's really only a matter of time. Next slide, please. It's really only, next one. It's really only a matter of time squeezed out at Kingston, and they end up on Mississauga Point, which is really a sad reflection of what happened and how the treaties failed our people. The early treaties failed our people. Mississauga Point now, you would never know Mississauga Point today. It was where it was a naval yard. Mississauga Point today in Kingston, other than the sign, the historical sign. But if we go down to the next slide. So this would be downtown Kingston today, Mississauga Point. So the survey, this would be what would be like a broken front. It would be like a broken front, so our people were pushed out to the broken front. And that's where they survived in Kingston after settlement moved in. And they bartered and they traded. And they utilized the lake. But it's sort of a sad end to their existence in the Kingston area, that they would be squeezed out to one of the points of land in and around Kingston today. The same with Gananoque and the Bay of Quinte group. Eventually, our people come together and fall under the Methodist influence at the Grape Island Mission. So the early treaties, the Crawford Purchase, and then the Rideau 12 interjects. There were at least 5 Bay of Quinte Mississaugas that were at the Battle of Chrysler's Farm, November 11th, 1813. John Sunday, James Indian, Big Jacob, Joseph Skunk, and John Pigeon. Process acknowledging our people's defense of Canada at Chrysler's Farm. It only took us 200 years to get recognized, but eventually it did come. And in 2016, myself and former Chief Jim Marsden, Veteran Elder Morris Mackenzie, we were invited to the Rideau Hall to accept the Defense of Canada Medal for our participation in the Defense of Canada during the War of 1812. So while it did take some time for that recognition, we finally got it. So those 5 men become 5 founding fathers, eventually, of the Alderville First Nation. But after the war, before Alderville and after the War of 1812, then new lands are taken up in quite a fast pace in what becomes southern Ontario. Also known as the Rideau Purchase, is one of the 5 land purchases between the Ottawa and the Thames River that took place between 1818 and 1819. All 5 affected Mississauga Chippewa groups were involved. Total, approximately 7,490,000 acres were taken up by treaty in those 2 years alone. And we're talking Treaty number 18. We're talking the Chippewa treaties over near the Thames. Treaty number 7. The Rideau Purchase was in itself 2,748,000 acres. And it was Treaty number 20 and Treaty number 27 that established the annuity system. Prior to that, it was goods and money, and that the annuity process was established for our people. I just want to say, too, before I move on, about the Royal Proclamation, the Royal Proclamation is held up as this great document, and it's important what it says it is. And the great covenant as this great moment in our history. But I think it's actually, there's an underside to that, which it spelled a great disaster for our people, actually. Some of those other wampum belts, they're intertribal wampums, but the Great Belt of the Covenant Chain was that belt that was commissioned by William Johnson and conveyed to those groups, the 24 nations or so that came to Niagara. An underside to that, and an understudied part of that process is what William Johnson did, which was to unleash alcohol into our communities. Tens of thousands of gallons of gut-rot rum, and cash, cold hard cash. And that's something that we don't concentrate enough on, is what was done at Niagara. Sir Jeffrey Amherst, who hated our people, he would have rather seen infested blankets used just to destroy our nations. He was removed, sent back to England, and William Johnson had a lot to do with that, to remove him and send him back to England. And it was Johnson that, and Fred Anderson, a great historian, great writer out of the University of Colorado, he talks about that and he discusses that at great length, how it is an understudied part of First Nations colonial history, how alcohol was used. Strategically, the guerrilla war, and we don't in their mind, we will not defeat them in a guerrilla war. Let's let alcohol destroy them. And that's the underside of the Royal Proclamation and the Treaty of Niagara. Just another yeah, bring it up here, please. Thank you. I'm tired of looking at myself. Down to 2 slides, please. Yeah. At 1819, 257 men, women, and children enumerated. In 1813 at Kingston, there were greater numbers enumerated, 407. There's some conflicting numbers on that. A friend of mine at Queen's regarding those numbers. 257, and then the 407 is just 6 years before that. And, you know, my question is, how do these numbers vary so greatly? But 642 pounds. I believe this is a copy of Rito that Patricia Kennedy sent me from the National Archives. She's long gone now. So after Rito, next slide, please. Yeah, next. Rito, to secure them from destitution, to prevent their demise. Ask yourself then, who and what did the treaty and treaties serve? By 1823, the Methodist Church had been planted and growing in Canada for the past 32 years. In that year, the first Mississauga were influenced by it at the west end of the Lake Ontario. And by 1825-26, at the Bay, in the persons of Potajega and Shawundis, Peter Jacobs and John Sunday, respectively. Here's a couple of great shots. On the right. There we go. John Sunday. That looks more like what he might have looked like, a pretty hardcore guy. I wouldn't want to meet him in an alley. And Peter Jacobs. John Sunday has factored strongly in our history in Alderville, very strongly in our history. So in 1820, the mission is established at Grape Island in the Bay. Quinte and the Methodists in Mississauga set to work to create a new community. By spring of 1827, Mississauga moved to the island. By summer of that year, upwards of 130 had moved to the island. John says Peter Jacobs and Peter Jones and John Jones from the west end of the credit. By June 1827, Sunday can read 2-syllable words in English and begins a life of advocacy for his people, not only for their souls, but for their diminished lands. Herein lies a man that now begins to walk. He will convey to you how important that was at the credit. In Rice Lake, Peter Jones was working amongst the Mississaugas there, teaching them how to plant potatoes on Spook Island. An ancient individual back to that island. And it's a very, very important island. Spook Island has played an integral role in the lives of the Mississaugas at Rice Lake. So 1827 is a very important year amongst all the people along the Lake Ontario frontier. There's actually a nice, probably a drone of Grape Island to this day. Grape Island, very nice island. In fact, it came up for sale. It's Alderville put an interest in to purchase the island. It would be, I think it would be a coup if we could actually secure that island to ourselves. Next slide, please. So the subject of Grape Island, it's a fascinating subject. There's no doubt about it. And the version of Christianity at great length. I probably first came upon that subject area in great depth by reading Don Smith. It's a very fascinating period of our history, but it's the only one that we knew at all. The story did, however, it presented an early interpretation that, in my recollection, suggested that our people had no interest in their lands, as I already said, at the Bay in Kingston, that in coming out of the darkness and into the light, they willingly gave up what and who they were. Well, that's false. He had taken hold of an ordained minister. He never gave up his quest for the security of our diminished lands, for title deeds, to avoid becoming paupers on their own land. In never adorning himself again in traditional regalia or dress, and quoting 2 Corinthians, therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Old things are done away with. Behold, all things are become new. That did not, however, eradicate his inherent quest for the security of our diminished lands. So he was a very interesting man. While he became converted, a devout Christian, he never gave up and his quest to secure title deeds for our diminished lands. So Grape Island is a fascinating period of our time, period of our history, but it didn't last very long. It was quite impractical to be able to farm, for instance, teach our people how to farm on Grape Island, 10-acre island, and then have to canoe over to the next island to sow your wheat or tend to your cows. That's quite an impractical way to. So in the 1930s, our people start to seek out and request new lands. And so they are asked to go to Rice Lake. And it's Henry P. Chase and John Sunday who actually go as early as 1833 up to Rice Lake to seek out new land to move our people. Originally, though, they were looking at land next to Hiawatha. But that never got off the ground. So they chose land, and they were, if you will, granted land in what became Elmwood Township, or Annick Township, as the Scottish would say. Annick, Elmwood Township, 2,000 acres, a grant. That word really bothers me. Our people treated for land to allow for settlement, and then they're given a grant to move to Elmwood Township. The first block of land was 2,000 acres, laid out in 50-acre lots, in which the people would build their houses and learn how to farm. And downtown Alderville became the site of the first chapel, and so in the 1830s, 1835 is the survey date. Frederick Rubridge was the surveyor. Elmwood Township was surveyed in 1826. So when that overlay, when that reserve survey, when it was overlaid, example, there were Crown Road allowances that had been laid out on the township map, but had not been removed from the township map when this Alderville Reserve was surveyed over the township. So those Crown Roads still exist in our reserve. So 1835, the survey, first survey, 1837 is the founding date of Alderville. And our people, it is said, moved in two waves, up the Trent River, up to around what would be, and then another group came up the Lake Ontario to around Cobourg and out what is called the Sully Portage to Rice Lake. And so 1837 is our founding date. And a lot of pictures here. It's into the 1840s that we see the Bagot Commission, and the idea of the industrial school comes out of the Bagot Commission. The cornerstone was laid in 1849 at Alderville, and so this is an important time. The Alderville Industrial School. William Case was the mover and shaker, Peter Jones, but the important thing to remember about, it's a it could be deemed a predecessor of the residential school, because the whole idea was to bring kids to Alderville where they would reside and learn how to farm. And this is also where the division of labor takes place. This is where women or young girls are taught to stay in the house and become, where the men are taught to become farmers, where the boys are taught to become farmers. A great labor pool. But I see that it's a time when the division of labor takes place, because the women were important on the land, and now they're being asked and being taught to stay off the land and stay in. The intent is to teach our people to become farmers, to become self-sustaining in the face of settlement. But the important thing is that our people retained their self. If you think 1867, what happened in 1867? Somebody tell me. Got it? 1867. In the 1850s, there is no Canada. In 1850s, our people, the latter part of the 1850s, that the government, the Crown, is trying to define what an Indian is. So our people could, a non-native boy might stumble upon the reserve and be adopted and raised as one of ours. There was no such thing. And they could make or break those schools. The idea was that those communities that agreed to send their people to Alderville would send also 1/4 of their annuity money to help support the school. In March 1861. And so it's not until 1867, Section 9124. It's not till 1879 sort of is embedded in the minds of government. By that time, the industrial school at Alderville had already come and gone. So I just want to go down and etc. What happens at Alderville? Nothing. Nothing really is happening. The government failed in its attempts to create farmers out of our people. In 1875, the government convinced our people, and 1875, failed attempts at the industrial school, failed agricultural policy, caused the government to convince our people to surrender up all their arable land. Are just hanging on to survive, and it becomes a relatively poor community. But our people never stopped. On Canada, of course, but on our community. I've grown up under the shadows of the Alderville War Monument, just like a lot of our 3 generations before me. Between August and September. Next slide. Oh, gee, there I am again. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, that actually the one above. That's, yeah, right there. That's my uncle, who are alive to this day. This is Shirley Smoke. Oh, sorry, Shirley Smoke and King Crow. They are my mother's oldest brother and sister, and they're still alive today. Shirley will be 22 this month. Okay. Yeah, next one down, please. Just next one down. On totems, this people used their totem, the last treaty. You'll see John Storm, Crane, got John Sunday, John Simpson, who is the great-grandfather of Fred Simpson, the runner. Same with the Scugog and Curve Lake. It was the last treaty that I've seen that they used their totem. Here's a next one down, just your classic council from 1888. This is my great-grandfather. Francis Beaver, Mitchell Chubb, William Lukes, and this is John Thackeray. He was the Indian agent. That's a classic photograph. Next, please. Next, please. In Alderville. Here's a photograph from around the 1890s of harvesting on Rice Lake. I still harvest. I harvest today. I'm a traditional harvester. Hardcore around some of the corners of our treaty areas. In Treaty 27, for instance, the Mississippi River, and other corners that I won't say anything about where they are. Here's my boy actually parching rice a few years back. Him and Jeff Beaver dancing the rice. I showed my boy pictures of my Uncle Alf Simpson from 1907 dancing rice and parching and processing rice, and I said to him, see, you're doing it the same way. And he was quite amazed at that. Next slide, next slide. Just some visuals of Rice Lake. This is coming down to what we call Vimy Ridge, which is our reserve land off the water at the beginning. And so it took 60 years for our people to get land back on the water. And Vimy Ridge, which is down the road and then just to the right and along the water, it was secured in 1914 to get our people into Rice Lake. But it took upwards of 60 years for our people to get land back on the water. And Vimy Ridge was secured in 1914. It was renamed Vimy Ridge, of course, because of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. And then on the north side of the lake, and just around the corner, this is a little East Grape, and around the corner is Sugar Island. Our people secured Sugar Island in 1899 to get into the rice beds. So people never gave up the quest to secure land back on the water. And so even though it took 60 years, they were successful by 1899, 1908, 1914, getting land back on the water. Towards Gore's Landing, next slide. This is Sugar Island. Actually, I took this photograph out of a plane, actually. I wasn't flying it, I was a passenger, but it was during our First Nations land. 100-acre island, very important archaeologically. The ROM was there in the early 70s. David Boyle was there in 1897, and Boyle discovered I'd like to know where they are. The ROM. Sugar Island, very important. It's remained uninhabited. We've never put any cottages, never allowed any cottages, nothing on that island, which is next slide. Here's another shot I took of Rice Lake looking south. And Hiawatha is probably down here somewhere. Beautiful shot. Next shot. And here is our beautiful The Black Oak Savanna is one of the rarest ecologies in central southern Ontario. And myself and Rick Beaver, we were instrumental in putting species at risk. I'm going to give you 7 more minutes. And the Black Oak Savanna is an interesting piece of Alderville First Nation because it never fell under the plow. When we started to put the and so today it's about 130 acres. At the beginning, it was difficult to convince our First Nation that we wanted to preserve our land and preserve our ecology. Because let's face it, the Indian Act didn't care about. Fast forward, we're lucky that by 1999, this area, can we go back to that slide? I'm tired of looking at that guy. By 1999, that and all of the pressure, and so we started working with the federal government, Environment Canada, Habitat Stewardship for Program, or for species at risk, and we were able to develop a management regime, develop the data that we have compiled out of that site is phenomenal, and it's where the spirit lives. We can build our health sciences, we can build our health centers and our glass and our brick and all that. Computers, and we can do that, and that's important work. We have to do that, but we can't forget what is the essence of our history in this area. It's the land, and the Black Oak Savanna is one of the most pristine sites in southern Ontario. We won the North American Pollinator Award. Rick and one of our coordinators went to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. to accept that award. It's about this big. But the notoriety that goes with it is phenomenal. We won 3 provincial awards for what we do at the Black. Because we can't afford to lose this kind of site. We cannot afford to lose this. In 1993, when capital planning and when these consultants were coming into our community, yep, not a word of a lie. Well, I don't know where those consultants are today, but I know where the Black Oak Savanna is. Next one down, please. Here's my beautiful shot of the beautiful Hiawatha across the lake. My grandmother, she was born there. Tom's going to talk about Hiawatha this aft. Next one. Here's Fred Simpson in later years standing beside a huge sunflower. Next one. Fred agent was a federal civil servant, and I don't know how much he was making. A school teacher was making about $400 a year in 1907. About $400 a year. Fred Simpson could make 10 times that money. Purses worth $10,000 in New York City. Him and Longboat. Next one. Quick shot of Fred Simpson on the Canadian Olympic team. Pretty well. After Fred beat him in England, Tom didn't like that too much, and he said, "Next time I'll beat your head off." And I think he did, actually. Alderville lost 9 soldiers in the First World War. That monument that is built today, the 9 bases around the base of that monument represent the 9 soldiers that died in the First World War. Peter Comago. Comago, next one please. Samson Comago, sniper. He was the first Alderville warrior that perished in the First World War, November 15th, 1915. Samson Comago was over 45 years old when he signed up for service. Scugog, the casino has changed the face of that community. It's a bit of a balancing act for myself, being concerned about the environment, being concerned about the water, being concerned about the overall push to develop our lands, being concerned about political whim. The new government today, the provincial government, when you hear things about getting into the Oak Ridges Moraine, that's really alarming, and it's a concern of mine. And so as First Nations, probably under more pressure than we've ever been, because now we're in the greater Golden Horseshoe planning area, which suggests that we're going to see 4 more million people come into this area in the next, whatever, by 2041. That's pretty daunting. And so we have a lot of work to do to not only preserve create a balance, and it's a difficult time. But I think I'm positive that we'll get there with good education. And I think right on, I'm about 12, 16. So thank you very much, everybody.